Okay, look, welcome. I'm amazed that you all turned up. It's cold, it's midwinter, it's miserable, and Paul over there shouldn't be here. And if he drops dead, we're not going to stop. Okay, you understand that, Paul? So don't die. Okay, all right. Look, we've been going over the last few months about the different groups of political activists which were sent to Australia as convicts between 1788 and 1863 when transportation ceased. And we've had some possibly interesting sessions in the last two sessions. One was on the swingers, which were the rioters in southern England, agricultural labourers. Then we spoke about the Tolpuddle martyrs, and today I'm going to talk about the Chartists. Now they're all from the same period, from 1831 to 1849. Not only do I want to talk about what they stood for and their transportation here, but the impact they've had on Australian society, an impact which is basically not acknowledged. Now the Chartists were formed in 1837, the same year that the Tolpuddle martyrs were pardoned and returned back to Australia, and they were formed for one very good reason. In 1824, the Combination Act was repealed, which allowed trade unions to be formed mainly in northern England and southern Wales, which were the new industrial heartlands. The Tolpuddle martyrs were about forming a union for agricultural workers in southern England. Now, the swingers were basically rioters in 1831 who were basically protesting about the fact that the enclosure of 6 million acres of public land had forced them into starvation, basically. And as I said before, 500 were transported here. Okay. Now, transportation was used as a mechanism to try to water down dissent. So the more active people who were found guilty in a court were transported to Australia, and that acted as a safety valve. And in many regards, the revolutions that occurred in France and parts of Europe during this period occurred because there was no safety valve, and people remained in those communities and continued to protest or were executed or imprisoned. In Britain, because it was the empire in which the sun never set, Sydney, Port Jackson initially, and then Van Diemen's Land, and then other parts of Australia, were seen as a place to send recalcitrants, because making martyrs of activists only created more problems. Now, there was a revolution in terms of production in England with the introduction of steam and steam engines and industrialisation, the enclosure of agricultural lands. And what this created was a new class of people who, if they were not employed, because the charity laws were so draconian, if they were not employed, they faced starvation. Before enclosure, they could actually grow their own food on the public common lands, but enclosure meant they didn't have that option. So what happened is people moved into trade unions. Now, although there were a number of strikes during this early period, people soon realised that trade unionism wasn't enough. When you had the landowners, the new employers, and the government against you, to succeed through strike and rioting was difficult, if not impossible. So the Charter movement was formed in 1837 as a political movement to get people into the House of Commons. The Chartist movement was not a revolutionary movement, it was a reformist movement. They didn't want a republic, they wanted economic reform. That's what the Chartism was about. So the National Charter Association was formed in 1837, and in May 1838 its principles were elucidated. Now the thing about the Charter movement is, because of all the significant changes that are occurring in England and Scotland and Wales because of industrialisation, what you saw is local communities forming their own little groups. And this was the first national workers movement that occurred in England or Britain. So the Chartist demands were incorporated in what they called a People's Charter. It was called the People's Charter. And before I go into the People's Charter, I want to talk about the Great Reform Bill in 1831 and 1832. Now the pressure from below with riot and industrial sabotage was so powerful, and the fact that being the French Revolution, the landowners and the Tories in England were very, very, very concerned about revolutionary activity and them losing everything. So in 1831, at the election in 1831, although only about 10% of people, males, were involved in the electoral process, there was a push for reform. And the Whigs, who were basically the representatives of the new bourgeoisie, which was being created in the industrial north and in Wales and Scotland, won an overwhelming majority for a mandate. But this overwhelming majority was won through people struggling. And in 1831 there were a series of riots to bring the Great Reform Bill. So people in southern England, the swingers, people in northern England, in the emerging trade union movement, expected reform. Now what happened in 1831 is that the liberal bourgeoisie, which had been at the forefront of political activity, talking about abstract concepts like freedom, liberty, all these abstract didn't deliver the changes that were expected in 1832 when the Great Reform Bill occurred. Although there were some changes, the changes only benefited people with a significant amount of property which they either owned or rented. So the Chartists were basically a middle class, small business, working class movement which broke away from the liberal bourgeoisie. They wanted bread and butter, knife and fork reform. They weren't interested in abstract concepts like liberty, freedom. They wanted real changes to their economic situation, because as I said before, if you didn't work, you faced starvation, and if you worked long hours, 6-7 days a week for minimal return. So the Chartist movement was a political movement by the middle classes, the working classes and small business people for reform. Because what the Great Reform movement did is it extended the franchise to 20% of the males in England. Not everybody, as was expected with the Great Reform Bill, and people felt that they'd been cheated. But the strike waves which occurred weren't enough to force change. So these groups formed around England, Wales and Scotland. They were called a charter groups because they had a charter. Now you all remember the Magna Carta. That was the nobles' charter. People tell you the Magna Carta was about British, liberty for the individual. It was about the nobles containing the prerogative of the king or the queen. It was the nobles having some say in the country. The Chartist movement was a people's charter. It was a charter to ensure that people were involved in the decision-making process in England, Scotland and Wales. So what were their principles? What was the People's Charter based on? The People's Charter was based on 6 principles. The first one was a ballot or a vote for every adult male over 21 of sound mind who wasn't in a jail. The second point was a secret ballot, because when your livelihood depends on an employer or a landowner, to vote the wrong way is the end of your livelihood. So they wanted a secret ballot. The third thing is they wanted the property qualifications to be removed so that every male could be involved in the process to elect a member to the House of Commons. Then they wanted equal constituencies, because in the past what would happen is you'd have constituencies that would have 7 people and elect 2 members to the House of Commons, and constituencies with 40,000 which was elect 1 member. So they wanted equal constituencies. Some of that had changed with the Great Reform Bill in 1832. Then they want payment of members. It's all very well for a dilettante or somebody with income to be a parliamentarian, but if you rely on your work to survive, you need to be paid. And last but not least, and this I think is the most important principle, which most people overlook, is they wanted annual elections. They wanted elections to occur every year. Why did they want elections every year? Because they understood the limitations of the parliamentary democracy. And if you look at the People's Charter, it talks about bribery, intimidation, and the inability of many representatives to actually deliver what they promise. So they understood the limitations of parliamentary democracy, but in order to overcome those limitations, they felt that if people were elected for 12 months, there would be less chance of intimidation and bribery, and a greater chance that they would respond to the people that elected them. So this is the People's Charter, which came out in May 1838. In September 1838 was the first big demonstration in Lancashire for a People's Charter. Now, what a People's Charter demanded was these changes to be made through Parliament. They weren't calling for the overthrow of the monarchy, they weren't calling for the overthrow of the House of Lords, but they were calling for a change to the ability for people to be elected into Parliament, because they believed, they believed that if they could get people into Parliament, there'd be the greatest good for the greatest number, which we know doesn't work. But that's what the belief system was. Now, a lot of people think this is just a male-dominated movement. The fact is that when the Charter was formed and the Charter associations were formed, there were many women involved in that particular struggle, and there were many minorities. The minorities in England at that time were Catholics and Methodists, and they were heavily involved in that change because they saw their oppression linked to that. And if you look at the original documents, they go through that. Now, something I forgot to mention was that when the Whigs were elected in 1831 on a reform ticket, the House of Lords refused to pass the legislation. So King William IV was forced to appoint enough lords, new lords, to the House of Lords to allow the legislation to be passed, because they were frightened of a possible revolution from below, because the agitation which occurred during that period. There were over hundreds of arrests, and 27 of those involved in those protests in 1831 were deported to Australia, some for life. Now, so getting back to the Charter. So how did it work? Well, what you'd normally had is petitions, mass demonstrations, and then on a particular day, they'd all walk to the House of Commons to present the petition to the House of Commons. Now, there has been a history in the British monarchy of people presenting petitions to the House of Lords and to the King, That's the way things used to work. But this was about presenting a petition to Parliament to change the way people were elected to Parliament. Now, Parliament saw this as a movement to create an alternative Parliament that actually challenged their power, challenged what they were able to do and what they weren't able to do. So what happened is that in June 1839, the first mass petition after a big march was presented to the House of Commons. The House of Commons refused to accept the petition. So what happened? Riots. Riots occurred over England, but more importantly, one of the leading Chartists in southern Wales, called Henry Vincent, was arrested. And what happened is that a number of people in southern Wales, led by three men, John Frost, who was a former mayor of Newport and a draper, self-employed businessman, William Jones and Zephaniah Williams, right, led marches through southern Wales collecting miners and iron workers, who were the main people involved in the new industrial landscape. And they descended on Newport in southern Wales. Now, they descended on Newport in southern Wales, and they were armed and they were angry. And the landowners, the major landowners, the major employers with 60 soldiers were cornered in the Westgate Hotel. So I think it's good that we're here in the Footscray Hotel. Keep it up. But they were cornered in the Westgate Hotel, and a fight ensued. And at the end of the fight, 24 miners were dead, 50 were wounded, and many were arrested. Of those arrested, 29 went to trial. And John Frost, William Jones, Zephaniah Williams, plus 5 others were charged with sedition and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Treason, high treason, all right? They were found guilty, and the death for high treason in 1839 was hanging, drawing, and quartering. And I've explained what that means, and I'll explain it again for those who haven't been here. You don't want to, I don't have to, but I think it's important, because what it did, it is galvanised people into protesting about what was going to happen to these 8 people. At the same time, another 27 were sentenced to be transported to Van Diemen's Land. Why Van Diemen's Land? Because in 1840, transportation to New South Wales had stopped because the emerging colony didn't want any more convicts, because they were competing with the private sector, and they saw it as unfair competition because they were getting free labour. So they were deployed to Van Diemen's Land. So what happened to the 8 that were charged, including Frost, Williams and Jones, that were charged with high treason? They were transported to Australia for life, all right, to Van Diemen's Land. When they arrived in Van Diemen's Land, Governor Franklin felt that John Frost was such a threat that he was put in Port Arthur prison. But he turned out to be a pretty bright lad, and he became the secretary to the commandant of the prison, and then he became a school teacher, all right? And in 1854, he was given a partial pardon and went off to New York. In 1857, he was fully pardoned. Could you imagine that today? Could you imagine that today? You're charged with high treason, you're sentenced to be hung, drawn and executed, and a decade later, you're fully pardoned. You can go back to your home country. I mean, pardons were a very important way that political protest was contained in England at that in Great Britain at that particular point in time. The same happened to Mr. Jones and Mr. Williams. They were both also pardoned around 1856. Now, Jones and Williams had in such a good time in Tasmania that they decided to stay, and they became prominent business people in Tasmania. Frost went back to England. So that's the first petition, 1839. Now, in 1841, there was an economic depression. in the industrial sectors of Britain, in northern Britain, southern Scotland and southern Wales. And there was a lot of agitation because once again you had to rely on the workhouses to get enough sustenance to survive. And the churches decided who was worthy of working in the workhouses to get some sustenance. Now obviously if you were not religiously inclined, if you didn't go to church, it's a little bit like the Salvation Army today, you know, you didn't get the goodies. So there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of agitation at that particular point in time. So what happened is in June 1842, a second petition was presented to the House of Commons after a huge protest. Now, I'm not talking about 50 people on a petition, I'm talking about a petition with 3 million names. Well, when you think that in Great Britain at that particular time there'd be about 10 million people, that is 3 million names. And once again, the House of Commons rejected the petition, rejected the charter. Obviously this caused consternation in England and southern Scotland and Wales, and a number of quite significant riots broke out, quite significant riots. And what happened is people would go into factories, because remember steam was the primary industrial energy source. They'd go into factories and they'd force the foreman to remove the plug from the steamer. So if you remove the plug from the steamer, you've got problems. You've got no steam, it's the ultimate sabotage. So they were going from factory to factory, removing plugs from the steamers. This was called, you'll like this, the plug hole riots. You like that?
So they're draining the water out of the tank.
Well, no, you can't. If you take out the plug.
You plug out of the water tank, so there's no water to make.
Yeah, steam. Yeah,
There you go.
yeah, and you throw the plug away. Yeah,
Keep it for later.
yeah. So plug hole riots. I was a little bit. What's the word? I was a bit surprised. I didn't understand why they called them plug hole riots. Very simple. So there was a lot of disturbances in northern England, southern Scotland and Wales, southern Wales. So what did the Whig government do? It sent in 8,000 armed troops and cavalry into the industrial north to put down the rebellion. And the rebellion had occurred because they rejected the petition. And over 1,500 strikers were arrested. 245 went to trial. 146 were imprisoned, and 72 made their way to Van Diemen's Land. Now the leaders of the strikes were a chap called Fergus O'Connor. He was the editor of the Northern Star, which is a radical newspaper, things we don't have today, you know, the Northern Star. And another bloke called George Herney, and I think Thomas Cooper. They were the three main leaders of the rebellion. Now they actually weren't, this time, they actually weren't transported. The 72 that were transported were mainly rank and file type of strikers, but they'd taken quite vigorous action. So once again, the petition had failed. The principal activists had been transported. The thing is, when you transport somebody who's a breadwinner, you're not only affecting them, you're affecting their family, you're affecting their dependents, because there's no social security system, and they've got to rely on church charity to survive. So it's a huge thing to be transported. Now, of the 72 that were transported to Van Diemen's Land, guess what? They're all pardoned in 1854. Only 2, they found life comfortable in Van Diemen's Land, and only 2 returned back to England. The rest stayed there. Because what was happening is people were beginning to understand that life in the colonies wasn't as bad as life in England as an industrial worker or as a small business person. I mean, you had all this land which had been stolen from the original inhabitants. You had the opportunity to do things you could never do in England and create some type of security for yourself and your family. So the disincentive that transportation was supposed to be became a little bit of a joke after a while, because people would be transported and then they'd be pardoned and then they just disappear off the historical records. So after the 1842 disaster, the leading lights in the Chartist movement changed the direction. Of course, some of them had enough land or rented enough land or property to be actually eligible to be elected to the House of Parliament. So 5 years, believe it or not, after the plug hole riots, 5 years later, guess what? 2 of them, Fergus O'Connor, the editor of the Northern Star, and George Herney, were elected into the House of Commons. Now, once they got elected into the House of Commons, they fought with their noggin. They said, this is not working, this Chartist petition stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to fight fire with fire. So they formed the Chartist Cooperative Land Company. You like that? The Chartist Cooperative Land Company. And they bought land through offering shares to workers to be part of this cooperative. Then they subdivided the land and built homes on the land. Then they had a lottery of all the shareholders who wanted a house. And if your number came up, you got a house because you're a shareholder. So we're using a cooperative model. At the same time, because the land was held cooperatively, they were able to have more people reach the threshold as far as property ownership was concerned to stand and vote for Parliament, so they get more people elected into Parliament. But at the same time, they were still collecting signatures, still wanted the People's Charter, because there'd been no reform whatsoever, whether there were strikes, whether there were riots, no reform. So what happened in 1848, those of you who are familiar with European history, remember this is the year of revolution. There were revolutions across Europe, most of the major capital cities, but no revolution in England. So Fergus O'Connor and George Herney organised a mass demonstration at Kennington Commons in London. We're talking about tens of thousands of people. Some accounts say 300,000 turned up at this demonstration. The authorities, and then they marched to the House of Commons, the authorities were so concerned about revolution breaking out in England that they brought in 8,000 armed troops into London, and they appointed 150,000 special constables, 150,000 special constables to deal with the demonstration, which turned out to be peaceful. But when you bring a lot of people to one part of a country to stare down a rebellion, things break out in the rest of the country. So there are rebellions in Birmingham, Bristol, Glasgow, Manchester, and there were no special constables. And in Manchester, the rioters actually held the city for 3 days against the authorities. So in late 1848, another monster petition was presented and was rejected. Now by 1849, the whole Chartist movement had run out of steam, not because of the ideas, but because a lot of the Chartists immigrated. They went to the United States, they went to Canada, and guess what? Tons of them came to Australia. It was a Chartist heartland. So what happened? Look at the Eureka Rebellion of 1854. If you look at the principles of the Eureka Rebellion, which were elucidated on the 29th of November, it was the exact copy of the People's Charter with one addition: removal of the miner's licence. Now, when the Eureka Rebellion occurred, what that meant is that the authorities once again had all their troops in Ballarat. There were mass meetings and protests around Victoria, and for 12 months of the Eureka Rebellion, the major leaders of the Eureka Rebellion, both the direct action faction, Peter Laylaw, and the moral force faction, that's the non-violent faction, under Humphreys, were both elected to Parliament. Now, could you imagine today, if we broke out of this little hotel, began a riot, had a few guns, took a few pot shots, got slaughtered, and then the survivors would be elected to Parliament 12 months later? That was the force, the moral force that was being used in the community. So what happened is that Victoria was the first place in the world to introduce the secret ballot. By 1857, every man in Victoria had a vote. No property qualifications. And then over the next 150 years, there was a battle between them, the House, the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council, regarding the squatters and land ownership in Victoria. But it was the Chartist movement which had an impact as far as the Eureka Rebellion was concerned and what happened after that. Now, a lot of people forget that the Eureka Rebellion was not just about the 3rd of December 1854. There was a radical element to the Eureka Rebellion, which formed an alternative parliament 100 metres from the Victorian Parliament House at the Southern Market. And they were based on a delegate system, not a representation system. And in 1857 again, in 1857 they had a national convention, a Victorian National Convention of Delegates, with the demands of a free land and free grass. And I'm not talking about the grass the legalised cannabis party is about. I'm talking about grass for cattle and sheep. And at the same time, Victoria was the first place in the world which had compulsory universal public education. So extraordinary ideas which the Chartists had, which were then incorporated into the fabric of initially Victoria and later on, a year later, in New South Wales. Now, for years, the secret ballot around the world was termed the Australian ballot. So by the 1870s, the colonial forces in Australia had more rights than people in Great Britain. They had the right to vote, there was universal suffrage, there were equal constituencies, payment of members, but no annual parliaments. And that was always been a problem. Because what that means is that parliamentarians, representatives, are beholden to forces outside Parliament. And that's where we come to 2024 and what's happening around the world, where people are talking about the death of democracy. We're not talking about the death of rule of the people, by the people, for the people. We're talking about the death of authoritarian rulers and the death of parliamentary democracy. Because the Chartist struggle was to create a society through a parliamentary process where the greatest good was created for the greatest number. Over the last 50 years, because we've incorporated into our day-to-day lives, deregulation, which is a simple way of saying removing regulations that people have, removing regulations that people have struggled for generations. Privatisation, which means is going back to the forced enclosure of common lands between 1790 and 1840 in England. What that means is privatisation means public assets which were financed by the public, which provided the greatest good for the greatest number, goes back into the private sector. Then you've got corporatisation, which means basically the death of competition and the death of small business. And then you've got globalisation, which means, as you know, cheap labour. But the difference between the 1840s and the 1850s and the Chartist movement and today, and the Eureka Rebellion and today, is that most Australians, including small business people, and 90% of small businesses fail within 5 years of being formed in this country, mainly through unfair competition and corporatisation, side with those who make the rules. And if you look at these people involved in the Chartist rebellion, it wasn't just people working in factories, it wasn't just agricultural labourers. A significant number were small business people and tradespeople who saw that their exploitation was directly linked to their disenfranchisement. So what's it got to do with 2024? I'll get back to that. So if parliamentary democracy is about the greatest good for the greatest number, if that's the concept, that's why the Chartists went into Parliament, to change the equation. Now in 2024, around Western democracies, what we've seen through corporatisation and privatisation and deregulation and globalisation, what we've seen is this equation has been turned on its head. Today, vested interests, as we see with the CFMEU fiasco today, with the pylon, what we see is the fact that parliamentary democracy is now delivering the greatest good for the least number of people. And every statistical indicator indicates this, that 30 years ago, 50 years ago, if you're an investor who invested $1 in a business and it made a profit, 33% of that profit will return to the investor and 66, 67 will return to the workers who made the profit for you. Today, it's been inverted on its head. 1/3 goes to the worker, 2/3 goes to the investor. Now, we've subverted people into thinking they're all investors through superannuation. And you've got to remember, superannuation is nothing more than you paying for your old age. Nothing more. You pay for your old age, not the fact that you've worked and paid taxes all your life. You pay for your old age. So we've seen the failure of parliamentary democracy. And that's why people like Trump and Le Pen in France and many other people like Orban, they have moved forward rapidly because people understand, maybe not philosophically, but understand that through the system of government we have now, we are not seeing that distribution of wealth the Chartists fought for and many other people have fought for through the parliamentary system. Now, unfortunately, what promoted these ideas in England and Britain during that period was the fact that there was a radical bourgeoisie. What that meant is there were radical newspapers, there were radical activists. Although they were by using the rhetoric of freedom and liberty and that, there was that milieu which had an impact on other sections of the community. So when things happened, like when Frost and Williams and Jones and 5 of their colleagues were sentenced to hanging, drawing and quartering because they were involved in high treason, there were mass protests. there was a pushback. Today, if every one of us was arrested, as we've seen at the CMFU, when it's just an investigation, nothing happens because people have been so integrated into the system. So what happens is you look for somebody to drag you out of the mire. So if you've got a good communicator, irrespective of what they say, and if they've got the resources and money behind them, and you've got to understand that people like Trump have resources and money behind them, they can actually make an impact on people who traditionally would have been Chartists, who'd be fighting for the greatest good for the greatest number. So we are at a really difficult, dark period in human history. We see mass slaughter in Gaza and people shrug their shoulders. We see the rise of authoritarian rulers, and over 70% of the world's population is now being ruled by authoritarian rulers. It's difficult to dislodge without violent activity. We're seeing income inequality growing. I mean, I never thought in my 72 years on the planet that I would see a private Australian charity raising money to send Australian kids to public schools. I've got nothing against the Smith family. They're doing what they have to do. But what type of society allows 1 million children to live in poverty in this country? And again, it goes back to those principles the Chartists talked about. It's the failure of parliamentary democracy. And they understood that because they promoted annual parliaments to prevent the subversion of the popular will through a representative government. So there are huge links. Now, I'll go back to the Chartist land court because it's very interesting. When that folded, they formed a national land company, and guess what? They formed branches in Australia. And we had push for colonial governments to give land through the selection process to people who had no other form of income. In the 1890s in Melbourne, we had marvellous Melbourne in the 1880s, and we had starvation Melbourne in the 1890s when 10% of women in Melbourne were involved in prostitution to survive. And there were riots in the streets and people were starving. What happened? All of a sudden they found all this free land in the Dandenong Ranges and French Island, and people were given 5 acres of land as long as they stayed on the land. Then we had World War I, and we had the soldier settlements where soldiers who'd sacrificed their lives, who'd come back wounded, were given useless land to farm. But again, that principle was there, same principle, that if you're under pressure, reform changes. Remember the old revolutionary thing? The more pressure you place, the greater the number of reforms. No pressure, no reforms. And we are, unfortunately, Australia is a country without a memory, not just in terms of the colonisation process, but in terms of the contribution that so many people have made to create this society. If you ask somebody, where does the social security system come from? What have trade unions done? Most people look at you blank, not because they're stupid, but because there is no acknowledgement in our historical context, in our media, in our virtual platforms of the contributions people like these Chartists who were deported as convicts to this country made to the development of this country. Because you've got to remember, in the 1890s, Australia was held up as a pinnacle. It was held up as a workers' paradise. Not that it was, but it was held up. We had the first Labor government in the world. Unbelievable. So all I can say is, I carry hope. Hope is the love child of desire and expectation, the desire for change and the expectation that it will occur. Whether I'm delusional or not, who knows? But everything revolves. It goes round and round. Now, people may flirt with authoritarian rulers, but ultimately authoritarian rulers are about maintaining their power at the expense of the community. So what we need to do is not feel hopeless, cynical, marginalised. What we need to do is we need to keep the embers of revolt and the embers of change alive. We need to blow on those embers, because if we don't and they go out, the whole historical record will be lost, and we will never be able to follow the examples of people from the past. So if you're not a member of Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, I encourage you to join. If you're looking at this video, you feel helpless, marginalised, join Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. We may not be powerful, but we're there, and we keep those embers of reform and change and radical change alive. So thank you very much for coming on this cold night. Questions, please. We're all lost for words. I like that. It's too cold. You've all frozen. I did warn you. Bring warm clothes. It's a fascinating history of the Chartist movement. But the thing is, the difference, they had mass movements. We don't.
What alerted you? What got you into following this trend?
Well, I thought to myself, yeah. Well, what followed this train is look, I like to think that I'm knowledgeable about Australian history, and it was through my understanding of the Eureka Rebellion and redefining it. People see the Eureka Rebellion as a rebellion which was about mining licenses. The Eureka Rebellion, in my opinion, is encapsulated in the Eureka Oath. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. Now, I think there are 4 principles in that. There's internationalism, because there are people from all corners of the world, irrespective of their colour and religion. There's direct democracy, because they had mass meetings and elected delegates. There was direct action, which was armed resistance against the tyrannical authorities. And now I'm lost. Direct democracy, direct action, internationalism, and solidarity. Now, when I started looking at the Eureka Rebellion decades ago, I came across the Chartist, the People's Charter. And I looked at the People's Charter and I looked at the English Charter. There was only one difference. The bastards stole it from the English and they just added. And then I thought, well, if these people have been deported and they've had such an influence, how many other groups have been deported? Was Australia the British Empire's Guantanamo Bay? Was it used to water down revolt, the possibility of revolt? Why was there revolution in Europe and the USA, but no revolution ever in England? You know? And then I found out, oh, there was the Scottish martyrs, there were the swingers, there were the Tolpuddle martyrs. There's all these different groups. Now, these were the Chartists were the last British political prisoners which were sent to Australia. And we're not talking about a few dozen. There are 163,000 convicts sent to Australia, and over 3,000 of them were political prisoners. So that's a significant number. And they had a profound impact on how this society was created, profound impact. So that's how it started. It's a fascinating history. It's there. I haven't done any original research. If you go into the net, if you look at books, you look at history, it's been documented by scholars, but it hasn't been popularised because it's not the type of thing people like to hear, or they're not interested in. Because see, we live what I call in a today's society. History started this morning. There's nothing before us, nothing in front of us. It's about a day-to-day life. Live in the moment. History doesn't matter. I mean, it's like Gaza. The Palestinian problem started on the 7th of October 2023. No history, 70-year history, wiped off them. It's the same with us. Nobody understands. Yeah. Why we have trade unions, why we have a social security system, why do we have universal health care, why we have an NDIS. And it's through struggle. Nothing is given to people without struggle. And the greater the struggle, the greater the pressure on those who exercise power, the more reforms that come your way. I hope that answers the question.
in delivering or going back to not the Whigs not doing the charter, even though they had a mandate?
Yeah, there was a weakness because what happened is you had a coalition of the new employers and the old gentry who believed that if you gave everybody the vote, that they would lose the power they were able to exercise. So you had the Liberal Reformists, which were the Whig Party, join the Tories, the gentry. And together they were actually able to prevent the bulk of people being involved in the parliamentary process. So it was and that's why the height you had to jump to be able to vote was so high. And that's property owners, yeah. Well, the thing is, people say, well, that's not true. Well, you either if you rented property of a particular value or owned property of you had the right to vote. So 653,000 British males were able to vote. And that's 1 in 5 males. That's what the reforms did. Now, people expected with the Great Reform Bill, they'd all be involved in the decision making. They expected it. Didn't occur. Oh, can I tell you a little aside, which is really funny? Now, well, it's not funny. In 1848, when the rebellion was put down, there were riots in Glasgow and there were riots in Liverpool. And this little group of people, it was called the Orange Tree Conspiracy, because they met at the Orange Tree pub. This little group of people, led by a tailor, another small businessman called William Cuffy, C-U-F-F-A-I, who was the son of a freed West Indian slave, right? And they were involved in a conspiracy, in inverted commas, to subvert the government, right? And guess what? William and 8 of his followers, because of this conspiracy, they were transported to Van Diemen's Land. 6 years later, they're all pardoned. William Cuffy is one of the original instigators of the Tasmanian trade union movement, because most people who were deported as convicts to Australia kept their head down once they got their pardon and tried to make a buck. But he was a troublemaker, and he continued to agitate to change the Master Servants Act, and he's instrumental in being involved in the formation of the Tasmanian. So you should look him up. He's a very interesting character, William Cuffy. And he had his dues when he died. People, paid him his due. Today, no radical activist has paid their due. Look at the Assange thing. Julian Assange, all the people involved in the struggle to keep that campaign going over, 12 to 14 years? He gets free. What happens to all those activists who spent so much time not even acknowledged?